Look at him, Julian! Clara's voice cracked, vibrating with a desperate, raw fury that silenced the crowded courthouse steps. She gripped 9-year-old Leo's shoulders, forcing the boy forward into the blinding glare of the afternoon sun. He has your eyes. He has your hands. He is your son. Julian Vance paused, his hand hovering over the door of his sleek black town car. The cameras of a dozen journalists flashed, capturing the sharp, aristocratic angles of his face. Angles mirrored perfectly in the trembling boy standing before him. Julian didn't flinch. He adjusted his pristine cuffs, his gaze sliding over Leo as if the child were nothing more than a smudge of dirt on his polished Oxfords. "I have no son, Clara," Julian said, his voice cold, level, and loud enough for every microphone to catch. "Whatever fantasy you've spun to extract money from my family ends today. The DNA results were clear. Now, get this child away from me before I have my security remove you." He stepped into the car, the heavy door slamming shut like a casket. Beside Clara, Leo's small hand tightened around a crumpled, ash-stained envelope hidden in his coat pocket, a secret rescued from a dying fire years ago, waiting for this exact moment of betrayal. The air in Clara's small apartment always smelled faintly of rain and lemon polish, a sharp contrast to the suffocating scent of expensive cologne and ozone that seemed to follow Julian Vance. Clara slammed the deadbolt shut, her chest heaving as she leaned her back against the door. The adrenaline that had carried her through the circus on the courthouse steps was rapidly draining, leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion. She closed her eyes, still seeing the cruel indifference in Julian's gray eyes, still hearing the mockery of the reporters who had swarmed them. "Mom?" She opened her eyes. Leo was standing in the middle of the narrow hallway, his oversized winter coat still buttoned to his chin. He looked so much like Julian, it physically ached to look at him sometimes. The same dark, wavy hair, the same high cheekbones, the same solemn, analytical stare. But while Julian's eyes were ice, Leo's were warm, harboring a quiet intelligence that far exceeded his 9 years. "I'm okay, sweetie," Clara lied, forcing a soft smile as she knelt to help him unbutton his coat. "I'm so sorry you had to hear that. Your father. Julian is just angry. He's trying to protect something that doesn't matter." "He's not angry," Leo said quietly, his voice devoid of the tears Clara had been bracing for. "He was scared." Clara paused, her fingers resting on the top button of his coat. "Scared?" "When he looked at me, his hand shook," Leo whispered. "Just for a second, before he got in the car." Clara's heart did a slow, painful roll. She had been too consumed by her own rage to notice such a detail, but Leo noticed everything. He was a watcher, a keeper of secrets. Leo reached deep into the inner pocket of his heavy wool coat. When he pulled his hand out, he wasn't holding a toy or a coin. He was holding a thick, cream-colored envelope. The paper was expensive, the heavy, textured cardstock favored by the Vance estate, but its edges were blackened and curled, smelling faintly of old soot and cherry wood smoke. "What is that, Leo?" Clara asked, her voice dropping to a cautious whisper. "I found it 3 years ago," Leo said, looking down at the damaged envelope. "When you took me to his big house, before he told us we couldn't come back. He was burning papers in his study. He got a phone call and walked out of the room. I saw this in the fireplace. It was on the edge where the fire hadn't reached yet. I used the metal poker to slide it out." Clara felt the room tilt. "Why didn't you show me this before?" "Because you were always crying back then," Leo said simply, his young face wearing an expression of gravity that no child should possess. "And because I wanted to know why he hated us. I couldn't read the whole thing back then, but I can now." With delicate care, Leo pulled a folded, partially charred letter from the envelope. The top corner was gone, consumed by the flames, but the elegant, sweeping handwriting of Julian's late father, Arthur Vance, was still perfectly legible on the surviving parchment. Clara's hand trembled as she took the letter from her son. She recognized Arthur's handwriting instantly. The old patriarch had been a ruthless man, but he had possessed a strange, rigid code of honor. Before his sudden death 4 years ago, he had been the only member of the Vance family who had shown Clara any semblance of kindness. As her eyes scanned the singed paper, the first few words made her breath catch in her throat. "My dear Julian," the letter began, "by the time you burn this, and I know your pride will urge you to destroy it, the truth will already be set in motion. You cannot run from your own blood, nor can you use the Vance fortune to bury your sins. The boy, Leo, is—" The rest of the sentence was obscured by a jagged patch of black carbon, but lower down, the words became clear again. "The only true heir to what I leave behind. If you deny him, you forfeit everything. I have secured the proof where your lawyers cannot reach it. Do not let your fear of the illness ruin your son's life as it has ruined yours." Clara's knees buckled. She sank onto the small bench in the hallway, the paper fluttering in her grasp. "The illness," she whispered, her mind racing. Julian had always been obsessive about his health, tracking his vitals, demanding absolute perfection from his body. But Clara had never known of any illness. What was Arthur referring to? And what proof had the old man hidden? A heavy, rhythmic knock on the apartment door startled them both. Clara immediately folded the letter, hiding it behind her back. She looked through the peephole, her shoulders instantly relaxing as she recognized the broad, familiar silhouette standing in the dim hallway. She unlocked the door, throwing it open to reveal Thomas Vance. Thomas was Julian's older half-brother, the black sheep of the family who had walked away from the Vance billions a decade ago to run a rugged boatyard on the coast. He wore a faded flannel shirt, his dark beard dusted with a bit of sawdust, his gray eyes warm and filled with deep concern. "I saw the news," Thomas said, his deep voice instantly grounding Clara's spiraling thoughts. He looked past her to Leo, his expression softening. "Are you two okay?" Thomas's workshop sat on the edge of the harbor, smelling of salt water, cedar, and engine oil. It was a sanctuary of honest labor, miles away from the sterile, marble-floored high-rises where Julian spun his webs of corporate deceit. Clara sat at a heavy wooden workbench, holding a mug of black coffee that Thomas had pressed into her hands. Leo was a few feet away, fascinated by a brass ship's compass, gently spinning the dial. Thomas stood by the wood-burning stove, his large frame casting a long, protective shadow over the room. He had spent the last 20 minutes carefully studying the burnt letter under a magnifying lamp, his brow furrowed in intense concentration. "It's Arthur's signature, without a doubt," Thomas said, his voice low so as not to carry to Leo. "And the implications of this, Clara, if Julian knew this letter existed, it explains why he went to such extreme lengths to discredit you." "But the DNA test, Thomas," Clara said, her voice tight with frustration. "The court-ordered test came back negative. How is that possible if Leo is his? I was never with anyone else. I loved Julian. Even when he started changing, when he became cold and paranoid, I was faithful to him." Thomas pulled up a wooden stool and sat close to her, his gaze intense and unwavering. He reached out, his rough hand hovering over hers for a fraction of a second before he gently placed it over her trembling fingers. The warmth of his touch sent a quiet thrill through Clara, a sudden, unexpected spark that she tried to suppress. Thomas had been her rock for the last 3 years, always keeping a respectful distance, but the unspoken tension between them had been growing with every passing month. "Julian is a monster when he's cornered, Clara," Thomas said softly. "But he's also a coward. If Arthur's letter is correct, Julian didn't just bribe a lab technician. He had a powerful motive to fake those results." "What motive? He has hundreds of millions of dollars. Why would he care about a child's inheritance?" "Because of the inheritance clause in Arthur's will," Thomas explained, his thumb lightly brushing the back of her hand. "Our father was obsessed with legacy. He knew Julian was volatile. Before Arthur died, he restructured the family trust. If Julian failed to produce a legitimate biological heir by his 35th birthday, 90% of the Vance estate's voting shares would automatically transfer to a charitable foundation, leaving Julian with a comfortable allowance but absolutely no control over the company. Clara gasped. Julian's 35th birthday is next month. Exactly, Thomas said. But look at what Arthur wrote here. Do not let your fear of the illness ruin your son's life. Julian has a secret, Clara, one he's been hiding from the board of directors, from the media, and clearly, from you. What kind of illness? I don't know, Thomas admitted, his eyes darkening. But Arthur says he's secured the proof where Julian's lawyers couldn't reach it. We need to find out what that proof is. If we can prove Julian manipulated the DNA results to deny Leo, we can strip him of his control over the company and get Leo the security and medical care he deserves. Leo's ears must have perked up at the word medical. The boy looked up from the compass, his expression solemn. Leo had been born with a mild pulmonary valve stenosis, a heart condition that required expensive monitoring and potential surgery in the coming years. Clara had been working 2 jobs just to afford his specialist appointments, while Julian lived in luxury, ignoring every legal appeal for child support. Mom, Leo said, walking over to the bench. Look at the back of the envelope. Thomas turned the singed envelope over. In the dim light of the workshop, they hadn't noticed the faint embossed seal on the back flap. It was partially melted, but the distinct shape of an anchor wrapped in a serpent was still visible. That's the seal of the St. Jude Medical Archive in Boston, Thomas muttered, his eyes widening. It's a private, highly secure facility where the city's elite store their confidential medical histories and genetic records. Julian's medical records, Clara whispered, a sudden wave of hope washing over her. If he has a genetic condition, it would be documented there. And if he used a fake DNA profile to deceive the court, then the real profile, and his actual medical status, is locked in that archive. Thomas finished. He looked at Clara, his expression a mix of determination and something softer, deeper. It's dangerous, Clara. Julian has security teams, influence, and friends in high places. If he finds out we're digging into this, he won't just ignore us anymore. He'll try to destroy us. Clara looked at her son, who was watching them with quiet trust. She felt a fierce maternal fire ignite in her chest, burning away the last remnants of her fear. She looked up at Thomas, finding strength in his steady gray eyes. Let him try, she said. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a sea of glittering diamonds, silk gowns, and artificial smiles. It was the annual Vance Foundation Gala, the crown jewel of Julian's public relations campaign. Tonight, he was expected to announce a massive corporate merger that would cement his legacy and his absolute control over Vance Industries just weeks before his 35th birthday. Clara stood in the shadow of a massive marble pillar, her heart hammering against her ribs. She wore a simple, elegant black dress that Thomas had helped her procure, her hair pinned up to expose the pale, tense line of her throat. Beside her, Thomas looked remarkably handsome in a tailored tuxedo, though he looked utterly uncomfortable in the high society setting he had rejected years ago. His hand rested lightly on the small of Clara's back, a warm, reassuring presence in the hostel room. Are you ready for this? Thomas murmured, his eyes scanning the crowd. If Julian's security spots me, they'll alert him immediately. We have to move fast. I'm ready, Clara said, her voice steady. Where is the archive liaison? He should be near the VIP lounge, Thomas said, nodding toward a cordoned-off area guarded by 2 imposing men in earpieces. Arthur used to donate millions to St. Jude's. The director of the archive, Dr. Vance's old friend, is attending tonight. If we can get to him, show him Arthur's signed letter, he might agree to help us access the records legally. Before they could take a step, the crowd parted, and a ripple of quiet applause swept through the room. Julian Vance had entered the ballroom. He looked spectacular and terrifyingly cold. He wore a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo, his posture rigid and commanding. Beside him was his elegant fiancée, a wealthy heiress whose family's assets would be merged with his own. Julian's face was a mask of aristocratic perfection, but as he turned to greet a group of investors, Clara noticed something. His left hand was tucked slightly behind his back. When he reached out to shake a colleague's hand, his fingers trembled, a subtle, fleeting tremor that he quickly masked by gripping his champagne flute. Leo was right, Clara thought, her breath catching. He's hiding something. Suddenly, Julian's gaze swept across the room. His cold gray eyes locked onto Clara. For a split second, the polished mask slipped. A look of sheer, visceral panic crossed Julian's face, quickly replaced by a dark, dangerous fury. He whispered something to his fiancée, handed her his glass, and began walking directly toward Clara and Thomas, his security detail falling into step behind him. "We have a problem," Thomas muttered, stepping slightly in front of Clara, his jaw tight. "Thomas." "Clara," Julian said as he approached, his voice low, venomous, and laced with absolute contempt. "I should have known you'd be behind this ridiculous stunt at the courthouse, Thomas. Dragging a bastard child into the mud to embarrass me." "He's your son, Julian," Thomas said, his voice a low growl that carried an immense, suppressed power. "And you know it. Arthur knew it too." Julian's eyes flickered at the mention of their father, a momentary twitch of his jaw betraying his composure. "Our father was a senile old man who died babbling nonsense. Whatever lies you're whispering in Clara's ear won't change the court's ruling. The DNA tests are final. If you don't leave this premises immediately, I will have you arrested for trespassing and harassment." Clara stepped out from behind Thomas, her eyes blazing. She leaned in close to Julian, her voice dropping to a whisper that only the three of them could hear. "We know about the letter, Julian," she said. "The one you tried to burn in your study 3 years ago. The one where Arthur told you that if you deny Leo, you forfeit the entire estate." Julian froze. Every ounce of color drained from his face, leaving his skin looking ash gray under the ballroom's crystal chandeliers. His gaze darted between Clara and Thomas, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. "You're bluffing," Julian whispered, his voice suddenly sounding thin, stripped of its corporate authority. "We have the letter, Julian," Clara said, her heart soaring as she realized they had struck a nerve. "And we know about the St. Jude Medical Archive. We know you're hiding an illness. We know why you faked the DNA test." Julian's security guard stepped forward, but Julian held up a trembling hand, stopping him. He stared at Clara, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a desperate, calculating malice. "You have no idea what you're playing with, Clara," Julian hissed, leaning in so close she could smell the expensive gin on his breath. "If you reveal what is in those archives, you won't just ruin me. You'll destroy Leo's future before it even starts. There are things, secrets, that are meant to stay buried. If you don't drop this, I swear to God, I will make sure you and that boy disappear where no one will ever find you." "Is that a threat, Julian?" Thomas stepped forward, his massive frame towering over his younger brother, his fists clenching at his sides. "It's a promise," Julian spat. "Get out of my sight, both of you." As Julian turned and walked away, his security guards flanking him to block them from following, Clara felt a chill run down her spine. The stakes were no longer just about child support or inheritance. They were fighting for their lives. Thomas turned to Clara, his eyes filled with a fierce protective urgency. He reached out, taking her hands in his. "We have to get to Boston, tonight, before Julian can use his contacts to destroy whatever is in that archive." Clara nodded, her resolve hardening. "Let's go." The rain came down in sheets, blurring the taillights of the semi-trucks ahead into bleeding red smears. Inside the cabin of Thomas's old Ford F-150, the only sounds were the steady, rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers and the soft, heavy breathing of Leo, who lay asleep across the back seat, wrapped in a fleece blanket. Clara stared out the passenger window, her fingers tightly interlaced in her lap. The ambient amber glow of the dashboard highlighted the sharp tension in her jaw. Every few minutes, her eyes flicked to the side view mirror, half expecting to see the sleek, predatory headlights of Julian's security detail cutting through the storm. "He won't catch us on the interstate, Clara," Thomas said softly, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to physically push back the chill in the air. His large hands were relaxed but firm on the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the dark road ahead. "Julian is powerful, but he's also careful about his public image. He won't risk a high-speed chase on a state highway, not with his precious merger hanging in the balance." "You don't know him the way I do, Thomas," Clara whispered, her voice cracking. She turned her head to look at him. When he looked at me tonight, it wasn't just anger. It was desperation. A cornered animal is the most dangerous kind. Thomas's jaw tightened. "I know him better than you think. We grew up under the same roof, even if I was always treated like a second-class citizen. Julian was always Arthur's favorite, the golden boy groomed to inherit the throne. But Julian was also fragile. He couldn't handle failure. He couldn't handle weakness." Clara leaned her head against the headrest, closing her eyes. Her mind drifted back to the early days of her relationship with Julian. Before the coldness, before the paranoia, he had been charming, attentive, almost obsessively devoted to her. But then, shortly after she got pregnant with Leo, a wall went up. He became distant, flying into sudden rages over minor details, tracking his heart rate, locking himself in his study for hours. When Leo was born with his heart condition, Julian's demeanor shifted from cold to downright hostile. He accused her of infidelity, demanded a DNA test, and threw her out of his life. "Why didn't you tell me about the inheritance clause years ago?" Clara asked, opening her eyes to look at Thomas's strong, rugged profile. "I didn't know the specifics myself until Arthur's lawyer contacted me after the funeral," Thomas admitted, his gaze softening as he briefly looked over at her. "Arthur wanted me to act as a check on Julian. He knew Julian's pride would destroy the family legacy. But I wanted nothing to do with the Vance money. I thought Julian was just being his usual arrogant self. I didn't realize he was actively trying to destroy you and Leo to keep his hands on the wheel." He reached across the console, his large, calloused hand resting beside hers. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silent understanding between them was heavier than any words. Clara felt a sudden, fierce wave of gratitude. For 3 years, Thomas had been a shadow in her life, always there to fix a leaky faucet, to drop off groceries when money was tight, to teach Leo how to tie knots. He had never asked for anything in return. He had kept his distance, respecting her grief and her struggle, but tonight the boundaries were blurring. "You should get some sleep," Thomas said, his fingers lightly brushing against the side of her hand. The warmth of the touch sent a quiet, electric shiver through her. "We'll be in Boston by dawn. We need to be sharp." "I can't sleep," Clara said, turning her hand over so her palm met his. His fingers slid into hers, gripping them with a steady, reassuring pressure that made her feel, for the first time in years, completely safe. "Every time I close my eyes, I see Julian's face when I mention the archives. Thomas, what if the proof Arthur hid is something that hurts Leo? What if Julian's illness is genetic?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. He only squeezed her hand tighter as the truck tore through the rainy dark, heading toward the secrets buried in the heart of Boston. The St. Jude Medical Archive was an imposing structure of gray, brutalist concrete, tucked away in a quiet, historic corner of Boston. It looked more like a fortress than a medical repository, its narrow windows tinted dark as obsidian. By 9 in the morning, the rain had slowed to a gray drizzle. Clara, Thomas, and a quiet, observant Leo walked through the heavy glass doors of the lobby. The air inside was sterile, smelling of ozone and expensive paper. "Can I help you?" a receptionist asked, her voice professional and entirely devoid of warmth. Thomas stepped forward, pulling the singed, cream-colored envelope from his jacket. "We are here to see Dr. Robert Sterling. We have a personal document from Arthur Vance." The receptionist's eyes flicked from the burnt envelope to Thomas's face. She paused, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. Dr. Sterling is the director of the archives. He does not take unscheduled appointments. Tell him Arthur's eldest son is here, Thomas said, his voice dropping to a commanding octave that brooked no argument. And tell him we have the missing piece of the 2022 deposit. The receptionist hesitated, then picked up her desk phone. After a whispered conversation, she looked up, her expression considerably softer. "Third floor, room 302. Dr. Sterling will meet you there." The elevator ride was silent. Leo gripped Clara's hand, his small fingers cold. Clara squeezed back, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. Room 302 was a private, wood-paneled viewing room. A few minutes after they arrived, a side door opened and an elderly man with thin silver hair and sharp blue eyes walked in. He wore a crisp lab coat over a tailored suit. He looked at Thomas, a sudden emotional glint in his eyes. "Thomas," Dr. Sterling said, stepping forward to shake his hand. "You look so much like your father, but you have your mother's eyes." He turned his gaze to Clara and then down to Leo. When he saw the boy's face, his breath caught. Dear God, the resemblance is undeniable. "Dr. Sterling," Clara said, stepping forward, "we need to know the truth. Arthur left a letter. He said he secured the proof here. What did Julian do?" Dr. Sterling sighed, walking over to a heavy mahogany cabinet. He unlocked it with a physical key, then scanned his fingerprint on a digital pad inside. He pulled out a thick, leather-bound file. "Arthur Vance was my closest friend," Sterling said, placing the file on the table. 10 years ago, Julian came to this facility under an alias. He was experiencing minor cognitive lapses and a persistent tremor in his left hand. We ran a full genetic sequencing. The results were devastating. Sterling opened the folder, revealing a series of complex DNA charts. "Julian has Huntington's disease," Sterling said quietly. "It is a rare, degenerative genetic disorder that causes the progressive breakdown of nerve cells in the brain. There is no cure. The symptoms usually present themselves between the ages of 30 and 50. Julian's onset was exceptionally early." Clara felt the air leave her lungs. "Huntington's... Oh my God." She looked down at Leo, her heart slamming against her ribs. "Leo, is it inherited?" "It is autosomal dominant," Sterling explained, his voice filled with gentle sympathy, "which means a child of an affected parent has a 50% chance of inheriting the gene. Arthur was devastated. He wanted Julian to step down, to focus on his health, and to ensure that his child, should he have one, would be cared for. But Julian was terrified. If the board of directors found out he had a terminal, neurodegenerative illness, he would have been stripped of his CEO position immediately. So Julian hid it," Thomas said, his voice tight with a dangerous, simmering fury. "But what about the DNA test? How did he fake the court-ordered paternity results?" When Clara filed for child support, the court demanded a DNA profile, Dr. Sterling said, pointing to a sheet of paper in the file. Julian knew that if he submitted his actual blood, the court's genetic mapping would expose his Huntington's markers. It would become a matter of public record. His career, his merger, his legacy, all gone. Sterling looked directly at Clara. So, Julian used his power and his wealth. He had his personal medical team harvest a bone marrow transplant donor's DNA profile, a completely healthy, unrelated profile, and registered it under his own name in the national database. When the court compared Leo's DNA to the falsified profile, it came back as a 0% match. He didn't just deny Leo to save money, Clara. He denied him to bury his own dying secret. Clara covered her mouth, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes. He sacrificed his own son's health care, his own son's right to know if he has this disease, just to save his corporate title. Yes, Dr. Sterling said. But Arthur knew. Before he died, Arthur placed Julian's true genetic profile, along with Arthur's own verified paternity markers, in this physical archive. It is the only copy in existence. Julian's digital records have been scrubbed, but this physical file is legally binding. It proves Julian Vance is the biological father of Leo, and it exposes the massive fraud he committed against the court. Before Clara could speak, the red light above the door began to flash violently. A harsh, electronic klaxon echoed through the sterile walls. "Dr. Sterling," a voice crackled over the intercom. "Security breach on the ground floor. Multiple armed individuals have bypassed the reception desk." Dr. Sterling's face drained of color. "Julian's men," he whispered. "They're here. We have to go, now." Thomas reacted instantly. He grabbed the thick leather file from the table, tucking it securely under his arm, and snatched Leo's hand. Dr. Sterling hurried to the back of the room, pushing open a heavy oak door that led to an emergency service stairwell. "This leads to the basement loading dock. My car is parked there. Take the keys." He threw a ring of keys to Thomas. "Go, Thomas. Protect that boy. Don't let Julian destroy Arthur's last act of justice." "What about you?" Clara cried, her heart pounding in her ears as the sound of heavy running footsteps echoed from the hallway outside. "I am an old man, and I am the director here," Sterling said, a fierce, determined look on his face. "They won't dare touch me. Run!" Thomas pulled Clara into the stairwell, slamming the heavy fire door shut behind them just as the sound of wood splintering echoed from room 302. They flew down the concrete stairs, Leo's small legs straining to keep up. Thomas carried the boy for the final 2 flights, his face set in a mask of pure, concentrated adrenaline. They burst into the damp concrete cavern of the basement loading dock. "There!" Clara pointed to a modest gray sedan parked near a delivery bay. Before they could reach the car, the heavy metal doors of the cargo elevator hissed open. 3 men in dark suits and tactical earpieces stepped out. Leading them was a tall, scar-faced man Clara recognized instantly, Marcus Vance's personal cleaner and head of security. "Thomas," Marcus said, his voice echoing in the hollow concrete garage. He pulled a sleek black semi-automatic pistol from his coat, keeping it pointed at the ground, but clearly visible. "Stop right there. Hand over the file, and we can all resolve this like gentlemen. Mr. Vance just wants what belongs to him." "This belongs to the court, Marcus," Thomas growled, stepping in front of Clara and Leo, shielding them with his massive frame. "And Julian's time is up." "I don't get paid to discuss ethics, Thomas," Marcus said, his eyes narrowing as he raised the weapon. "Give me the file, or I'll take it, and I won't guarantee the safety of the girl or the kid." "Run, Clara!" Thomas roared. In a split second of pure, terrifying chaos, Thomas charged. He threw his weight into Marcus just as the gun went off, the deafening crack of the gunshot echoing like thunder in the enclosed garage. The bullet shattered a concrete pillar inches from Clara's head, showering them with dust. Clara screamed, but her maternal instinct overrode her terror. She grabbed Leo, shoving him into the back seat of Dr. Sterling's sedan and locking the door. She turned back just in time to see Thomas and Marcus locked in a brutal struggle on the oil-stained concrete. Thomas was stronger, but Marcus was trained. Marcus brought the butt of his gun down hard across Thomas's temple. Blood erupted from a deep gash, painting Thomas's face red. Thomas stumbled, but instead of retreating, he grabbed Marcus by the collar and slammed him violently against the side of a concrete support column. The gun clattered across the floor, spinning into a dark puddle of motor oil. The other 2 guards were closing in. One of them lunged for Clara. Adrenaline flooding her veins, Clara grabbed a heavy metal tire iron lying on a nearby tool cart. With a desperate, primal scream, she swung it with all her might, striking the guard hard across the knee. The man collapsed with a sickening crack, howling in pain. "Thomas, the car!" Clara screamed, throwing open the driver's side door. Thomas delivered a final, staggering blow to Marcus's jaw, sending the man sprawling onto the concrete. Dazed, bleeding heavily from his temple, Thomas stumbled toward the sedan. He collapsed into the passenger seat, his breathing ragged and wet. Clara scrambled into the driver's seat, slammed the car into reverse, and floored the accelerator. The tires shrieked, smoking against the concrete as she slammed the car backward, narrowly missing the third guard, before spinning the wheel and tearing out of the loading dock exit into the blinding Boston rain. In her rearview mirror, she saw Marcus slowly rising from the floor, wiping blood from his mouth, his eyes fixed on their retreating vehicle. He was already on his phone. Where are we going?" Leo whimpered from the back seat, his face pale as paper. Clara took a deep breath, her hands shaking on the wheel as she navigated the slick, crowded city streets, heading toward the highway. She looked over at Thomas. He was semi-conscious, his head lolling against the window, dark blood soaking through his collar. He looked fragile in a way she had never seen before, and a sharp, painful ache squeezed her heart. "We're going to the coast," Clara said, her voice hardening with a quiet, unbreakable resolve. "Thomas has a cabin in Maine. No one knows about it. We're going to patch him up, and then we're going to end this." She reached over, her hand trembling as she gently touched Thomas's cheek. His eyes fluttered open, gray and warm despite the pain, and he offered her a faint, bloody smile. "I told you," he whispered, his hand rising to weakly cover hers. You're tougher than you think." The storm followed them north, a relentless wall of black water that seemed to swallow the rugged Maine coastline. By the time Clara turned the mud-spattered sedan down the overgrown gravel driveway, the headlights barely cut through the dense, dripping spruce trees. At the end of the track stood Thomas's cabin, a low-slung structure of dark, weathered cedar clinging to the edge of a jagged granite cliff. Below, the Atlantic crashed against the rocks with a deep, primeval roar. "We're here," Clara whispered, her voice thick with exhaustion. Her shoulders were stiff, her hands cramped from gripping the steering wheel for 5 agonizing hours. She turned to the passenger seat. Thomas was awake, but his face was dangerously pale in the dim dashboard light. The makeshift bandage she had fashioned from a flannel shirt in a gas station restroom was soaked through with dark blood. His eyes, usually a sharp, commanding gray, were clouded with pain, yet they focused on her with a fierce, quiet intensity. "You did good, Clara," he murmured, his voice barely more than a dry rasp. "You got us here." In the back seat, Leo was asleep, exhausted by the sheer terror of the day. Clara turned off the ignition, and the sudden silence, save for the howling wind and the crashing waves, wrapped around them like a heavy shroud. With Clara supporting most of his weight, they managed to get Thomas inside the cabin. The interior smelled of seasoned pine, dried lavender, and old wool. It was simple, neat, and deeply reflective of the man who built it, unpretentious, strong, and safe. Clara guided Thomas to a heavy plaid sofa near a stone hearth, while Leo, half awake, stumbled into the small guest bedroom and collapsed onto the mattress, instantly falling back into a deep sleep. Clara returned to the living room, her chest tight. She found a medical kit in the bathroom and knelt on the floor beside Thomas. The fire she had quickly built in the hearth began to crackle, casting long, dancing amber shadows across his rugged features. "This is going to hurt," she warned softly, her fingers trembling as she peeled back the blood-soaked cloth from his temple. "I've had worse," Thomas said, trying to smile, though a sharp intake of breath betrayed him as the cool air hit the raw, deep laceration Marcus had left. With gentle, agonizingly slow movements, Clara cleaned the wound. She was so close to him she could feel the heat radiating from his skin, could smell the metallic tang of blood mixed with the scent of pine and rain. Her fingers brushed against his jaw, feeling the rough stubble. Every time he winced, her own heart skipped a beat, a physical ache mirroring his pain. "Why did you leave the family, Thomas?" she asked quietly, needing to break the suffocating silence, to keep him talking, keep him conscious. 10 years ago, you walked away from billions. Why? Thomas stared at the ceiling, the firelight catching the moisture in his eyes. "Because I saw what the money did to Arthur. I saw what it was doing to Julian. It turns people into monsters, Clara. It makes you look at your own flesh and blood and see only liabilities or assets. I wanted to be a man, not a shareholder. He looked down at her, his gaze dropping to her lips before rising back to her eyes. And then, 3 years ago, I met you. Clara's hand froze. The cotton pad in her fingers hovered inches from his face. Thomas, I knew you were Julian's, he said softly, his large, warm hand rising to gently cover hers where it rested against his temple. Even after he threw you out, I knew the rules. I kept my distance. I became the helpful neighbor, the guy who fixed the plumbing. But watching you fight for Leo, watching you love that boy with everything you had, even when you had nothing, it broke me, Clara. It made me realize what I had actually walked away from. Real family. Real love. The tension in the room shifted, turning from the terror of their flight into something heavy, sweet, and electric. Clara felt a tear slip down her cheek. For 3 years, she had felt completely alone, carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. But looking into Thomas's eyes, she realized she hadn't been alone at all. I was so scared tonight, she whispered, her voice cracking. Not just for me, for you. When I saw Marcus hit you, I thought, I'm not going anywhere, Thomas said. He sat up slightly, pulling her closer. His hand slid into her hair, his thumb gently wiping away her tear. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned in. When his lips met hers, it wasn't a tentative touch. It was a desperate, fierce release of 3 years of unspoken longing. Clara let out a soft sigh, her hands finding their way into his thick, dark hair, pulling him closer. The kiss tasted of salt and rain, a sanctuary in the middle of the raging storm outside. For the first time in her life, Clara felt completely, unconditionally safe. When they finally parted, their foreheads rested against each other, their breathing synchronized. We still have to open the file, Thomas whispered, his hand gently squeezing her shoulder. Clara nodded, her eyes hardening with renewed purpose. Let's find out what Julian was willing to kill for. The morning sun rose cold and pale, cutting through the heavy gray fog that rolled off the Atlantic. Inside the cabin, the fire had died down to a bed of glowing red embers. Clara sat at the rustic wooden kitchen table, the thick leather file from the St. Jude Medical Archive open before her. Thomas stood behind her, his head bandaged, a mug of steaming coffee in his hand, his eyes scanning the documents over her shoulder. Leo sat quietly at the far end of the table, eating a bowl of oatmeal. His eyes, wide and serious, kept darting to the thick papers. He knew his future was written on those pages. Look at this, Clara said, her finger tracing a timeline of genetic mapping reports. This is Arthur's private correspondence with Dr. Sterling. Arthur didn't just find out about Julian's illness after the fact. He suspected it years ago. She flipped the page, revealing a sealed official laboratory report with a bright red seal. Here are the court-submitted DNA results, Thomas noted, his voice tightening. And right behind it, the real genetic profile of Julian Vance. Dr. Sterling was right. The DNA profile Julian submitted to the court belongs to a 32-year-old leukemia survivor who had received a bone marrow transplant from an anonymous donor in Europe. Because a bone marrow transplant alters the recipient's blood DNA profile, Julian's team used this scientific loophole to legally submit his blood, knowing it wouldn't match Leo. It's medical identity theft, Clara said, her voice trembling with anger. He defrauded a court of law to deny his own son. But look at the next document, Clara, Thomas said, his hand reaching down to turn the page. His voice dropped to a tense, emotional whisper. Arthur did something else. He didn't just keep Julian's records. He had a private pediatrician collect a sample from Leo when he was a baby during his first heart checkup. Clara's heart stopped. She stared at the page. It was a genetic sequencing report for Leo Vance. Her hands shook so violently she could barely read the small print. The Huntington's gene. Julian's marker is on chromosome 4. She looked up at Thomas, her eyes wide with a terrifying, breathless panic. "Thomas, please read it to me. I can't look." Thomas leaned down, his eyes scanning the genetic markers. A sudden, massive wave of emotion washed over his rugged face. A deep, ragged breath escaped his chest, and his eyes welled with tears. He looked at Clara, a radiant, triumphant smile breaking through his exhaustion. "He's negative, Clara," Thomas choked out. "Leo didn't inherit it. He doesn't have the gene. He is completely free." Clara let out a choked sob, covering her face with her hands. The crushing weight of the last 9 years, the terror that her son had been handed a genetic death sentence, the guilt of bringing him into a world of such pain, evaporated in a single, beautiful second. She threw her arms around Thomas's neck, weeping freely against his shoulder. Thomas held her tight, his chest heaving as he buried his face in her hair. From the end of the table, Leo walked over, his small face curious. "Mom? Why are you crying? Is it bad?" Clara pulled away from Thomas and knelt in front of her son, grabbing his hands. "No, baby. It's the best news in the world. You're healthy. You're going to be completely okay." Leo smiled, a pure, innocent expression that warmed the cold cabin. Before they could savor the moment, the hair on the back of Clara's neck stood up. The silence of the Maine morning was suddenly shattered by the low, heavy rumble of a high-performance engine coming down the gravel driveway. Thomas reacted instantly, pulling Clara and Leo away from the window. "Stay down." He crept to the side of the door, peering through a narrow gap in the curtains. Through the thick, swirling coastal fog, a sleek, black luxury SUV slowly materialized. It stopped directly in front of the cabin. The doors opened. 2 armed guards in tactical gear stepped out, their weapons drawn. But it was the man who stepped out of the back seat who made Clara's blood run cold, Julian Vance. He looked unrecognizable from the pristine tycoon of the gala. He wore a dark wool coat, but his tie was gone, his collar open. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and surrounded by dark, hollow circles. As he walked toward the cabin, his left leg dragged slightly, and his left hand was shoved deep into his pocket, trembling so violently it shook the fabric of his coat. He was unraveling, physically and mentally, driven mad by the imminent collapse of his empire. "Thomas!" Julian's voice echoed through the foggy trees, cracked and desperate. "I know you're in there. Bring the boy and the file out. If you hand it over, I swear, I will let you all walk away. I will fund Leo's medical care for life. But if you make me come in there, I will burn this place to the ground with all of you in it." "We can't outrun them here, Clara," Thomas whispered, his gray eyes hard as flint as he looked around the small cabin. "The woods are too thick, and the cliff is a dead end. We have to face him." "We have the proof, Thomas," Clara said, her voice fierce, her fear entirely gone, replaced by a cold, maternal rage. "He can't kill the truth." "He thinks he can," Thomas said. He reached into a drawer beneath the kitchen counter and pulled out a heavy flare gun used for marine emergencies. "I'll draw the guards' attention. Clara, you take Leo and the file. If things go bad, run down the cliff path to the old boat dock. There's an inflatable Zodiac there. Get Leo out onto the water." "No, Thomas, I'm not leaving you," she protested, grabbing his arm. "You have to," he said, leaning down to press a quick, hard kiss to her lips. "I love you, Clara. Protect our boy." Before she could reply, the cabin's front window shattered into 1,000 glittering shards as a tear gas canister bounced across the pine floor, spewing thick, white chemical smoke. "Go!" Thomas roared. He fired the flare gun directly out the broken window. A blinding, white-hot magnesium flare erupted in the driveway, filling the fog with a deafening hiss and a wall of brilliant, blinding light. The guard screamed, temporarily blinded by the intense glare. Clara grabbed the leather file, tucked it under her arm, and snatched Leo's hand. They bolted out the back door of the cabin, emerging onto the damp, slippery granite of the cliffside path. The wind from the Atlantic whipped her hair across her face, the salt spray stinging her eyes. "Mom, I'm scared," Leo cried, his small shoes slipping on the wet rock. "Hold on to me, Leo! Don't look down!" Clara urged, guiding him toward the steep, narrow path that wound down to the churning sea below. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the fog at the top of the path, cutting off their escape. It was Julian. He looked like a ghost, his pale skin slick with rain, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. In his right hand, he held a sleek, silver revolver, but his left hand was clamped tightly against his chest, shaking uncontrollably, a physical manifestation of the disease he had spent his life trying to deny. "It ends here, Clara," Julian gasped, his breathing shallow and ragged. He pointed the weapon directly at her chest. "Give me the file." "Look at yourself, Julian," Clara said, stepping in front of Leo, her voice echoing over the roar of the waves. "You're sick, you're dying, and you're willing to kill your own son to keep a corporate title?" "He is not my son!" Julian shrieked, his voice cracking with a terrifying delusional mania. "The court ruled. I have no heir. If the board finds out, if they see those files, I will lose everything. My life's work, my merger, my legacy, gone." "Your legacy is already gone, Julian," a deep voice growled. Thomas stepped out of the fog behind Julian. He was bleeding from a new cut on his cheek, but his posture was solid, immovable. Julian's guards were nowhere to be seen, likely disoriented or incapacitated by the flare and the rugged terrain. Julian spun around, his gun shifting to point at Thomas. "Stay back, brother. I always knew you wanted what was mine. You always envied me." "I never wanted your money, Julian," Thomas said, stepping slowly, deliberately forward, his hands raised, but his eyes locked onto his brother's trembling weapon. "But I won't let you destroy this family. Look at your hand, Julian. You can't even hold the gun straight. The Huntingtons is taking you. If you kill us, who inherits the Vance name? Who carries on Arthur's legacy?" Julian's eyes darted wildly. His breathing became a desperate, sobbing gasp. I will find a way. I can cure it. I have the money." "Money can't buy a new genetic code," Clara said, her voice dropping to a tone of deep, solemn pity. "But Julian, there is something you should know. We read the file." Julian's gaze snapped back to her. "What?" "Leo is negative," Clara said, tears mixing with the rain on her face. "He doesn't have your disease. He is healthy. He is the last clean, true bloodline of the Vance family, the only legacy you have left, and you tried to burn him in the fireplace." The words struck Julian like a physical blow. He stumbled back, his boots slipping on the wet edge of the cliff. He looked down at Leo, who was staring at him not with anger, but with a profound, quiet sadness. For a brief, agonizing moment, the corporate monster vanished. In his eyes, Clara saw the terrified young man who had locked himself in his study years ago, realizing his body was betraying him. Julian looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw the perfect, healthy future he had thrown away. "Negative?" Julian whispered, his hand shaking so violently the gun nearly slipped from his fingers. He's safe?" "Yes," Thomas said softly, stepping into Julian's guard. With a swift, gentle movement, Thomas reached out and wrapped his hand around the barrel of Julian's gun, tilting it away from them. Julian didn't fight him. He let the weapon go, his strength entirely gone. "It's over, Julian. Let it go." Julian sank to his knees on the cold, wet granite, burying his face in his trembling hands. He began to weep, a hollow, broken sound that was swallowed by the roaring wind of the Atlantic. In the distance, the wail of sirens began to echo through the coastal pines. Dr. Sterling had kept his word. The authorities had been notified of the security breach in Boston, and the trail of Julian's hired men had led them straight to Maine. Thomas walked over to Clara, wrapping his powerful arms around her and Leo. Clara buried her face in his chest, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart. They were safe. The truth was out, and the shadow of the past had finally been lifted. 3 months later, the sun shone warm and bright over Thomas's boatyard. The air smelled of fresh cedar, salt water, and summer blossoms. The Vance merger had collapsed, and Julian had officially stepped down from the board to enter a private medical facility, his fraud exposed to the courts. The family trust had been restructured, securing Leo's future and ensuring he would receive the best education and cardiological care available. Though he would grow up far away from the toxic high-rises of New York, Clara stood on the wooden dock, watching Leo and Thomas. Thomas was showing the boy how to secure a cleat hitch on a beautiful, newly restored wooden sailboat. Leo was laughing, his cheeks flushed with healthy color. Thomas looked up, his gray eyes catching Clara's gaze. He smiled, stepping away from the boat and walking over to her. He reached out, his hand sliding into hers, his fingers locking with hers in a familiar, comforting warmth. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly, leaning down to kiss her temple. "I'm thinking about the future," Clara said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "For the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of it." Thomas squeezed her hand, looking out over the sparkling blue waters of the bay. "Neither am I, Clara. We built this together. Thank you for reading the dramatic journey of Clara, Thomas, and Leo. If you enjoyed this cinematic story of love, betrayal, and justice, please like, share, and subscribe for more suspenseful romance novels. Your support keeps the stories alive.